Welcome to Talaterra, a podcast about freelance educators working in natural resource fields and environmental education. Who are these educators? What do they do? Join me, and let's find out together. This is your host, Tanya Marion. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. Today's episode is about a topic I have long been curious about. In fact, it was the key motivation behind my previous endeavor. This topic is plant blindness. You may have heard me mention it before, and you may remember my conversation with Kathryn Parsley, the Ph.D. candidate at the University of Memphis, whose specialty is plant blindness and botanical literacy. In this conversation, Kathryn and I spoke about the tools she is creating to assess plant blindness in students. These are tools she hopes to make available to teachers so they can use them in any learning environment. You'll find a link to this episode in the show notes. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Kathryn back to the show to talk about an article she wrote that was just published in the journal Plants, People, Planet. In this article, she makes a case for renaming plant blindness. Joining us today is Dr. Elisabeth Schussler, one of the two botanists who coined the phrase plant blindness back in February 1999. She first presented this concept in an editorial piece with the late Dr. James Wandersee of Louisiana State University. Today, Dr. Schussler is a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Her research is focused on biology education, the dynamic between faculty and students, and she also works with grad students and their anxieties around teaching. Let's join the conversation. Kathryn and Dr. Schussler, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really glad to be back.
While some listeners may be familiar with the concept of plant blindness, some may not know what it is. Dr. Schussler, if I may begin with you, how do you describe plant blindness to people unfamiliar with the concept?
Sure. So when Jim and I proposed this idea, we referred to it, and I'm going to put this in quotes, as a condition. And so it's a condition under which somebody goes outside and views the environment and literally doesn't see the plants around them. They get distracted by all of the, wonderful animals that they see moving around, but they don't literally take the time or even notice or pay attention to the plants. Not that they don't see them, because obviously they make up, a large proportion of the biomass around us, but that they don't recognize them as individuals. And so it's a condition where you don't see them, you don't pay attention to them, you don't value them. There's a whole cascading set of things that go along with not paying attention to something.
What prompted you and Dr. Wandersee to coin the phrase? Were you motivated by gradually increasing tension around the issue? Or was it a reaction to an event?
No, it was not a reaction to an event. I was a grad student at the time that I met Jim, and I was taking a class on teaching about plants from him that he offered. I was a botany graduate student, so I was very interested in plants, obviously, and also just really interested in teaching in general. And when I took that class, I got really interested in this idea of educating around plants and how we can help people to notice plants around us. And Jim and I started collaborating, thinking, well, maybe we could write a grant together. And it just started this whole cascading series of conversations. We would meet, and mostly, honestly, it was just righteous indignance. We were botanists, and Jim was not necessarily a trained botanist, but he had grown up. His family ran a greenhouse. And so he knew plants really well and loved and adored plants. And just righteous indignance that people would go out and not see these wonderful things around them. And just in reading the literature, we thought maybe the prevailing explanation was not really what was causing the problem. The prevailing explanation was more like an active bias against plants. And that's not really what in principle, Jim really thought was going on, because he had done a bit of work on visual perception. And so it just was a funny rolling conversation of just us being angry that people didn't like plants.
That's funny. So why does plant blindness happen?
It is actually based in the brain. And I was thinking about this the other day. I like to think about it as like the factory settings that are in our brain. When we go out into the environment and we quote unquote see things, we have a lot of visual information that comes into our perception, through our eyes, and actually gets to, the brain area, but it has to be processed, right? Our brain can only process a certain amount of information that our sensory system brings to us. And what happens is that a lot of information gets filtered out. And that was the original idea with plant blindness, was that plant blindness is a filter that essentially filters out the plants in our lives because we aren't paying attention to them. And so it is a factory setting. It is something that I think is a bias that exists in all of our brains, essentially. And the only way that we can pay attention to plants is by learning about them, so that we can then raise awareness, have attention, and then actually that information goes into our brain rather than being filtering out. So factory setting, and also magnified by culture, because culture is all about the animals. At least here in the United States, I should qualify.
Yeah. In 1999, when you coined the phrase, you launched a nationwide campaign to increase public understanding of plants. You printed more than 22,000 posters and distributed them to science teachers at conferences. Your tagline then was "Prevent Plant Blindness." What was on these posters? What did they look like?
And the irony is that I do not have one of these posters. People ask me all the time, they're like, can you send me a poster? I'm like, I don't have a poster. So I have no idea. No, I actually saw one recently. I gave a talk at the Danforth Plant Science Center, and the director has one of these posters. And I got to see it, which I hadn't seen it in a really long time. It has a very artistic look to it. It's very Monet-like, in the background. Jim was a huge Monet fan as well. And then it had a pair of these like glasses that were floating above the landscape, and they were red. And the idea was that if you had these red glasses that were this filter, that you would, in combination with the green landscape, not be able to see the plants. And so it was representing the metaphor of plant blindness as being this filter that is preventing us from seeing plants. That was totally Jim's idea. He loved those posters. And then on the back, it had a whole bunch of ways that you could reduce plant blindness. And so it was on the back an action, like a call to action that would give teachers ideas.
That's very nice. And I'm sure that was received enthusiastically by science teachers everywhere.
So I think, Jim was always, he was an education professor, so he was always much more plugged into the K-12 system than I was. And so I think that he got great joy, in sending these out. For me, I remember one of the biggest things was that when we did this campaign, that we got a letter back from the current president of the Botanical Society of America, saying how wonderful this was and how much they appreciated it. And that to me was really valuable, because that was my professional organization.
Yes, yeah. Kathryn, you recently conducted a literature review about this topic. What did you discover?
So my literature review for the topic was mostly just trying to characterize it in context of these 4 kind of components that are slightly distinct but highly overlapping phenomena that are encompassed by the term plant blindness. And so I mostly did my literature review to try and flesh out those 4 components and give examples of them in a way that people would be able to understand and connect with in the paper.
The 4 components that Kathryn is referring to are attention to plants, attitude towards plants, knowledge of plants, and relative interest in plants.
And so most of the papers that I chose, obviously I have a bigger, more in-depth review for my dissertation that is, almost exhaustive at this point, probably not quite, but the papers that I chose to do for this particular lit review were very specific ones that I felt like were key papers in the field, papers that demonstrated these 4 different phenomena, these 4 components very well, and in a way that people would be able to catch on to my meaning, hopefully quickly and be able to understand what I'm trying to get across with those particular phenomena.
Yeah, in your paper, you make the case to rename plant blindness with the phrase plant awareness disparity. How did you decide on this phrase and its wording?
Yeah, so there were I came up with a few different options, and Beth sent me a couple of her ideas. And so I wanted to create a term that was still, true to the meaning of plant blindness, still encompass those 4 components of plant blindness well, and still have the same emphasis on the attention component that plant blindness does. But I wanted it to not use a disability metaphor, because disability metaphors are ableist by design, as they equate a disability, like actual blindness, with a negative trait, which is like not knowing about plants and not noticing plants. So that was my main drive behind it. And I don't, at this point, I've said plant awareness disparity so many times, I don't even remember what the other options were. But there were things like, I think, plant awareness differences or plant awareness deficit. But again, I didn't want to use deficit language either, because that's not particularly accessible either. But yeah, so it was just kind of a combination of like Beth kicking in some ideas and then my advisor kind of filtering through the ones that I sent to both of them. And finally we landed on plant awareness disparity, because it really accomplished both of those goals of, not being ableist, not using disability as a metaphor anymore, but still having the same concepts represented by the term.
I get the impression from reading your paper that it took a long time to rephrase this and to come up with the right language, because you explain it so clearly in your paper. But I'm thinking, goodness, how long did that take? And then do you, even though you don't remember all of them, do you have a list of how many you actually worked through?
Oh gosh. So I probably had at least 10 at one point. There were probably at least 10. I know I settled on 4 to send to my advisor, Jamie Sable, and she was the one who was like, I like this one the best. And that was one of the 2 that I happened to like the best. So I was like, here are 2 that I really like. Here are 2 that I'm not crazy about. Like, what do you think? And she and Beth both thought that plant awareness disparity was a really good one. But I think my original list, I had this Word document of what are terms for plants that I had, like phytology and botany and plant science and all these other like terms that I could think of for plants. And then, what are other ways that I can represent the concept of blindness? And so I had like awareness and disparity and attention deficits and, like all these different like synonyms for the same like 2 or 3 words all over this Word document. And I think I ended up with 10 different, total like actual arrangements of words that I thought were pretty good. So.
And how have people responded to your paper and your proposed name change?
So by and large, the response has been really positive. I got a lot of followers on Twitter recently, because I've been following just a bunch of botanists. And when I first tweeted about the name change, it was actually before the paper had come out. And because it was during Botanical Society of America meeting and the ASBB, American Society of Plant Biologists meeting. And so I tweeted out like, hey, Botany 2020 people, if you want a more inclusive term for plant blindness, here's a term that I'm planning to publish, or that I'm in the process of publishing, or something along those lines. And a lot of people really jumped on it, and they were like, oh, I love this, because I think for a long time in the botany community, botany researchers and botany educators were hoping for like a more inclusive term, a term that didn't, turn blindness into something bad, because disability is not a bad thing. And so, yeah, I had several people who like retweeted it and shared it. And then I got a bunch of followers and I started following. My rule is generally like, if I can recognize the person as a real person in their profile, I generally follow them back, because it usually leads to more people that I can then follow. And then I get all these really great connections and information and papers from a bunch of different botanists, which is, I originally trained to be a paleobotanist, and so that's where my interest in plants kind of came from. But so far everybody, the vast majority of people have really liked it. There have been some complaints about it, of course, because not everybody is going to like the ideas that you put forward. But yeah, by and large, people have really been super supportive, and that's been incredibly relieving to me, because you never know when you try to rename something as iconic as plant blindness to botanists, like you never know for sure. And botanists, I don't know if you know this, but botanists, I feel like, tend to be very particular about their terms. The terminology they use, and their, is it a pistil or a carpel, or there's a bunch of different double terms for the same thing in botany from what I remember, which admittedly it's been a while. But so I was a little nervous, but yeah, by and large the response has been really positive, which was very encouraging. So
yes, no, they are particular about their terms. Otherwise you wouldn't have books like Harris and Harris, the plant glossary. Beautiful books like that
for the leaf margins.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Yes. How does the name change affect your research? Will the Plant Blindness Index be renamed, do you think?
Yeah, so before I'd even published the paper, I went ahead and changed everything in my research to Plant Awareness Disparity instead of Plant Blindness, because I knew that even if not everybody accepted the term, like even if other people didn't do the term, I'm doing this research for my dissertation, and I wanted my dissertation to be very continuous in the way that I use the term. So yeah, I did rename the Plant Blindness Index to the Plant Awareness Disparity Index. And everything in my papers since then has actually been transferred to the new terminology. So the very first paper that I published as a first author was this paper, this, renaming plant blindness paper. And then from here on out, obviously, I wanted that to be setting the stage for the rest of the stuff that I want to publish later on. And so I decided, like, I need to go ahead and just make the change now and make it complete so that my entire CV or the papers that I publish, that I put out there, they'll all use the same terminology.
That is excellent planning and forward thinking. I was wondering about that. I said, oh my goodness, her tools have to change. No, that's great. Okay, I see your current situation as being similar to Dr. Schussler's situation in 1999. You have a concept, you have a new name, and you are introducing this name to the field and beyond the field. What type of outreach activities have you considered?
A better question would be, what type of outreach activities have I not considered?
Okay.
So I have tried to spread this paper far and wide as much as physically possible. I feel absolutely just bonkers that I did this, but I actually contacted the science writer Ed Yong. He writes for The Atlantic. He wrote the book I Contain Multitudes. And I actually reached out to him and was like, hi, I have this paper that I'm trying to publicize as widely as possible because I'm trying to replace the current term. And I actually got a response from him. I mean, he didn't take it, of course, but because he's writing about COVID nonstop right now. But he actually emailed me back and he was like, thanks, but I'm going to have to pass because I'm too busy writing about COVID. And I was like, oh my God, Ed Yong wrote me an email. I'm so excited. And then I obviously have been tweeting about it a lot. I wrote a blog post about it on my blog. I wrote a blog post about it for the University of Memphis biology department blog. Let's see. Oh my gosh, what else have I done? I'm in the process of trying to write an article about it, like an opinion piece about plant awareness disparity and how it affects grocery shopping habits, particularly in the time of COVID, because COVID has completely changed the way that we shop for groceries. And so now people are like becoming a lot more conscientious of where their groceries are coming from. And they're wanting to make sure that, like, some people are starting to buy locally more. And so I wrote a piece about that and I'm trying to get that published somewhere. If I can't get it published somewhere, I'll probably publish it as a Medium article just because it's easy to self-publish with Medium. And then I've mostly been trying to post as much as possible on Twitter and Instagram and share as much as possible. And then so Plants People Planet, which quick plug, is an excellent journal, by the way. I loved working with them so much. They have this really great, convenient tool where if you want, they will send a PDF of your article to like 30 or 40 of your colleagues. And so I came up with a list. I think it was 30 people on my list of colleagues that I knew really well, of people that I knew had published in plant blindness, of people that, it was kind of weird because some of these people I was like, oh yeah, that person literally works 3 doors down from me. And then some people were like, they work across the world from me. And so, but yeah, so, you come up with this list of people, and I sent it to Plants People Planet, and they sent out my PDF to those people. And so, mostly right now, obviously, like I haven't done any like speaking or engagements or anything because, everything that's going on right now has got everything out of whack. And so I haven't been invited to do anything, like it's not like a, whatever, but I've been writing about it mostly, and writing multiple media, multiple formats for both scientific and non-scientific audiences. Actually just had somebody come and approach me about translating some of my blog posts into Spanish and Portuguese so that we can reach a wider audience. I have a colleague who works in Brazil, and this particular person who asked me if I wanted them to translate my work into Spanish and Portuguese, he works in Colombia. And so I've been trying to get feelers out as far as physically possible, basically. And so the best way that I could think of to do that was to write some more, which is so much fun because I'm already writing so much for my dissertation. So I am well practiced at writing at this point. And it's really great to get this experience writing for a bunch of different audiences too. And I completely changed my personal website and my blog to reflect the terminology change. And I wrote a short blog post about that. So yeah, mostly it's just been, science communication through writing as much as possible.
That is excellent. That's so exciting. It's so exciting. Yes. And the more you write, the more things grow and you expand. And it's great that someone wants to translate your paper. That is very exciting. And what about science cafes? I'm sure in bookstores or, do talks, and people are doing things, of course, online now.
Right. Yeah. That is a good question, because I was about to be like, I don't know of any science cafes, but that's not true. I'm pretty sure we have a Science on Tap program here in Memphis somewhere. I don't know when or where they meet because I'm not a huge part of that or anything like that. But yeah, I guess, I could try to do something, some online speaking stuff. Mostly I've just been writing because I have it's easy to fit that into your free time. And so then you can just write a blog post on the weekend or after work and put it out there, and then it's out there, and then you can just tweet it and it gets pretty far. But yeah, I think I would really like to speak about it. I'm kind of excited for, I guess, my defense is the next time that I know that I'm going to be speaking. Oh wait, no, that's not true. I'm presenting at National Association of Biology Teachers, the instrument that I'm working on, which is almost done, by the way, the Plant Awareness Disparity Index. I wrote about that for them and they accepted me, so I'll be giving a talk there. So yeah, at least that's coming up.
Yeah, that is fantastic. Fantastic. Yes, everyone is their own media company. And so it's wonderful, yes, to work with other organizations and publications. But as you said, if it doesn't go that way, you can always publish it yourself, right? Yeah, that is fantastic. Dr. Schussler, 20 years have just transpired since you coined the phrase plant blindness, and you've watched people interpret your work and explore the concept. You also have years of experience teaching professional development for biology students and graduate students in particular. If you were to create a train the trainer type of workshop about fostering plant awareness for community-based educators like the ones in my audience, what might this look like?
That is a great question. I've been thinking a lot about how you shift something like this if it really is a factory setting, and I think that was something when I was doing this work that kind of depressed me a little bit, because I thought, well, if it's a factory setting, how do you fix that? But I do think you can fix it. I think what I always decided was that the work has to start very early. And that really, we need to be doing interventions in probably, kindergarten, first, second, third grade, and working with maybe garden clubs. Garden clubs tend to be very interested in this sort of thing because they obviously love plants and they do a lot of community outreach. And, and certainly nature centers and informal education. I think informal ed could be a really great lever. So I would almost want to train trainers that were in these community kind of leadership organizations, informal. I'm not sure it would necessarily be as much formal ed, but certainly maybe interested elementary teachers who love plants could be. And I think we need to help trainers who love plants understand what it is that students don't see about plants. And the thing that's interesting to me is when we look at things like animals and how easily we can name animals, it's because animals have defined shapes, right? So if you look at an elephant has a defined shape. All you need to see is the outline. You don't need to see color. You don't need to see anything. Giraffe, same thing. Rhinoceros, they have these really distinct, stable shapes that we use. And that's why it's so much easier for us to identify an animal than it is a plant. Plants, they grow throughout their lifetime. They don't have distinguishable, body shapes. Some of them do, but it's pretty rare. You have to really look at a much finer scale with plants. And I think that's what's exhausting maybe about trying to identify them, and having taken taxonomy as an undergrad, it is exhausting to identify plants. You have to look at very different scales. But I think that if you can get students to understand where to look and why you're looking there, then I think that's kind of one of the keys. And the other thing is you have to get an emotional component. And this is something that I look at with my undergraduate teaching. And I think it just prevails, whatever grade, is if students aren't curious about the plant, if there's nothing that's really intriguing them about what they're looking at, then you're really kind of lost. Then it's just boring. And so it has to be a plant that is intriguing. I know we used to work a lot, Jim and I, with lamb's ear, because lamb's ear is this shockingly furry, kind of plant. Anything that kind of shakes them out of the norm, anything that makes them go, oh, this is different, anything that makes them do that, and go, oh, interesting. That's the key. That is the entry point. And so learning how to foster curiosity, learning how to foster noticing, I think would be the two things that I would really focus on.
I can tell you that there are a whole bunch of people out there who work in informal learning environments who would love to experience a training course like that and would love to learn more. For example, the field of heritage interpretation. Interpretation is all about creating intellectual and emotional connections with a resource. And that is a wonderful group. They have a fantastic week-long conference. When it is in person, it's a week-long. In November, online, of course, this year. But that would be a very receptive and enthusiastic crowd. Wonderful group of people. Also, the North American Association for Environmental Education. They would love that as well. If I may ask a question about trade books, you have also done research about children's books. And with what I used to do, I used to have a bookstore and used to have of course, children's books about plants. It was the focus, is plant-based education. There are a wide range of books out there to introduce children to plants. Some of them are just so fun and exciting, and some of them are kind of, I don't want to say, but I'll just say bland, okay, to kind of straightforward. And what to you makes a good children's book about plants?
Oh, wow, that's a tough question. I think that what makes a good children's book about plants is going to be the same thing that makes a good children's book in general, which is that it should have really compelling illustrations. It should have an engaging story, something that kind of keeps you going as you're going along, and is intriguing. Something that you want to read over and over again. So one of the things that I find intriguing with children's books about plants is that we, as though I write them, that we don't personify plants. It's something that in children's books about animals, animals are personified a lot. And I think that that's an interesting it's an interesting divide. I think it's tougher to personify plants. I've really debated back and forth, would children's books be more compelling if we personified plants in the same way that we do animals? Would it get that emotional connection? And I seem to remember that with a lot of the children's books, there aren't a lot of plant personification. Typically, there's personification of an animal, with plants, which is kind of hilarious if you think about it. So they'll personify the animal, and the animal will be like gardening, but the plant isn't personified in any way. So I am on the fence about whether or not that's. As Kate had mentioned, botanists are a very particular bunch of people, and I think that there would be some botanists that would be horrified at the idea of personifying a plant in a children's book. But I think the general rules would hold. I think compelling, beautiful pictures, a great story, and good information about a plant. If you're going to do it, then you might as well learn something too.
So then, if personifying a plant is not an option, how might empathy be created for plants and for the botanical world?
Gosh, that's a tough one. I do know that when people grow plants, that there is, growth is probably the closest akin to personification, and so, if you think about the giving tree, which I have to say is not one of my favorite books, but that is in a sense, the tree growing, going through a life cycle, having things happen to it. There's an enormous amount of empathy just in the growth, and in the life cycle. And maybe people get a lot of empathy when they have personal plants, pet plants that they grow. And I think that it must maybe work the same way. Maybe it could with children's books.
Kate, what do you are writing, or you've been writing, showing connections between how people shop and the topic of plants. Do you see any avenues there about how you might be able to create empathy towards plants?
I don't know that grocery shopping is going to be the way to go for empathy towards plants, considering you're about to take them home and eat them. But I think I definitely agree with Beth in that I feel like growing plants is part of what gives you empathy for them. When I was little, I used to visit my grandparents' house, and they had this pot on their front porch that they grew strawberries in, one of those terracotta pots with all the pockets along the sides. And it didn't matter what season it was in. I wanted to know if there were strawberries, because strawberries to this day are one of my favorite things to eat. And so it could be the dead of winter if we showed up at their house, and I would be like, are there strawberries? Because I just thought this was just like a magical thing that happened, that plants just kind of happened and came from, like, I really did when I was little. I really thought like they were just like, how can you get a whole plant from the seed? That's like, it seemed impossible to me at the time. And so I was just like, this like has to be magic. So it doesn't matter what time of the year, right? Like, so I do think that growing your own food in terms of like groceries and shopping habits, I think growing your own food, that you're taking care of it, you're nursing it through an entire life cycle, and then you're harvesting it. And it also helps teach people to harvest sustainably, right? Because if you eat the whole thing, you're not going to have any more food later on. If you have an aquaponic garden, you don't want to harvest all of your lettuce at once. And so I think that is a really great model for helping people not only develop empathy for plants, but develop awareness of where their food comes from. It's a lot of work to grow our food, and a lot of people really just don't think of, especially when it comes to plants, they don't really think of where their food is coming from. They tend to just be like, oh yeah, my lemons are here, my avocados are here for my avocado toast, let's do this. So I think that still applies in shopping and things like that. I've noticed online a lot of pieces about people gardening and how that's been a really big trend during the pandemic, to get outside and to have some fresh air and get your hands a little bit dirty. And I think that is, gardening and growing things is going to be a good way to connect with plants. And then, having somebody teach you about them, having a plant mentor, is something that I feel like helps with plants. Just based on interviews that I've done with students in the past, I've had students who just did not care about plants at all. And then their professor stepped in and became a type of plant mentor for them. And they were suddenly like, oh, this is actually really cool. I didn't know that. And so I think a lot of times what helps us develop empathy with plants is having empathy for each other and having those connections with somebody that you care about, showing you things that are really interesting about something that they care about. At least that's kind of how it happened for me and how I think that it happens for a lot of the students that I work with. But yeah, I don't know, strictly from shopping habits, I don't know that I would be able to get from that to empathy for plants, but you know.
This pandemic is really and lots of people see it as a environmental education's moment, nature's moment. There's been lots of discussion about how to leverage this moment or this level of attention, that an environment doesn't normally have. And so how might you, if you could control everything and not fail, how might you leverage this moment?
I think for me, I would just, what wouldn't I do if I had all the control and didn't have to worry about failing? I really feel like one of my pet peeves about plant awareness disparity is the food thing, which is why I chose to write about it for the article that I'm working on. And so I honestly think that I would like to show people where their food comes from and just like take them on field trips to farms and show them like, here is a person whose entire livelihood depends upon feeding you, and your entire livelihood depends on eating what they grow. And having those connections be better, because I know that farmers feel underappreciated and they are underappreciated. And, I think that really understanding where your food comes from gives you a better understanding and appreciation for all the work that goes into how to get it to the supermarket, how to get it to your table. And I think that that would probably be my first priority is, your food, because everybody has to eat something. So I think that would probably be priority number one. And then I think number two would just be like, just trying to develop that empathy and those connections and relationships that will help cultivate that empathy for plants. Because I think something that tends to get overlooked sometimes is, we want students to know about plants. We want them to know. And if you try to just bombard students with knowledge without trying to correct for the attention component or trying to correct for their attitudes towards plants or their interest in plants, then you're probably not going to get a great result. There's a term in science communication research called the knowledge deficit model. And it's the idea that if scientists just teach the public more about science, the public is going to love science. And no, that's not how that works. And it's actually been, really criticized and largely, I guess, I don't necessarily want to say disproven, but it's kind of out of date in the science communication literature. And there's a new framework that I really like called the Besley framework. And it talks about like goals of science communication shouldn't just be knowledge related. They should be interest related. They should be related to building trust with your audience. They should be related to building credibility with your audience. It should be a give and take. It should not just be scientists lecturing the public or scientists, trying to pour knowledge into their heads like an empty bucket. And I think that that is something that the plant blindness and plant awareness disparity research, that's something that I really want to kind of bring into that area, because I think a lot of stuff, understandably, is about getting students to know about plants, and that's really important. Botanical literacy is kind of the end goal, but you can't get there if you don't address all these other problems along the way first. And so I think that that would be my next goal after the food literacy, is getting people to understand that like there are these other problems in the way, and finding ways of outreach and science communication that help address these attitudinal barriers and these interest barriers and these attention barriers as well. Of course, obviously it's harder to overcome attention because it's hardwired into our brains, but you can develop exercises that help hopefully accomplish that, and attitude or interest barriers as well. So I think that I would try to kind of bring plant awareness disparity research into that Besley framework area of science communication and develop those outreach and communication activities that would help people know that this is another way, and hopefully a better way to get at it than just bombarding students with plant knowledge. Because I happen to know firsthand that whenever you bombard students with plant knowledge who don't care about plants, they are not, they may learn something, but they're not going to maintain a long-term empathy for or a long-term appreciation for plants. And that's kind of not the goal. The goal is for them to long-term appreciate and care about and understand plants. And if you want that to happen, then you really have to address you have to address it from all the angles of plant blindness or plant awareness disparity.
Yeah. Dr. Schussler, faculty are on the front line. They are, in a sense, frontline interpreters of this story. How might faculty leverage this moment and be effective frontline interpreters?
Yeah. And it's tough because I'm in an ecology and evolutionary biology department. Students can concentrate in our area, but they get a biology degree. And so every student starts in these intro bio courses. And intro bio courses are notorious for not covering a lot of plant content. They're often taught by people, most likely by zoologists or microbiologists. I mean, there are botanists, of course, out there like me. But I find even me who teaches intro bio that I don't spend nearly enough time on plants as I should. And mostly it's because a lot of the great examples that are used in textbooks, examples that are used elsewhere, are animal examples. And I've tried to do a lot of plant examples, and the students seriously look at me like I have 5 heads and like daggers are coming out of their eyes. Like they're like, this is boring. I don't understand why this is important. And they'll even tell me, like, I do 2 days of plants, and they'll tell me, well, this doesn't have any relevance to me. I'm going to be a doctor. And I'm like, well, 70% of plant medicines are botanically based. And it's still like, they're just like, like they don't see the connection at all. So I haven't lost hope in intro bio, but I'm not sure that that's the sweet spot. I think if botanists could create more general education courses that were intriguing and interesting. I think Wisconsin has a course on the science of cooking, and you could get a lot of really great plant things into a course like that. We have a field botany course here that is for majors and also general education, just getting them out. And I find that a lot of college students love classes where they like to get outside and go into the field. It's so different than them sitting in class all day long. And you can really engage them, in botany through those types of courses or anything. I think general education might be the secret hero of helping plant awareness.
Yep. This has been a very exciting conversation. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. Dr. Schussler, I've of course read your papers, and I shared with Kate earlier that in 2009 I had a brief email exchange with Dr. Wandersee, and to be able to sit with you in person and meet you for the first time is really a thrill for me. So thank you so much for taking the time. And Kathryn, thank you for your paper and your fresh outlook and how you are making people see things they can no longer unsee. I think it's wonderful work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
To learn more about Kathryn's work and to learn more about Plant Awareness Disparity, see the links in the show notes. Here you will also find a link to the article where Dr. Schussler and Dr. Wandersee present plant blindness for the first time. Thank you for joining us today. See you next time. Talaterra is a podcast for and about independent educators working in natural resource fields and environmental education. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Tanya Marion.